He was ready to lose everything. The bank had already set the day they would take his land, but one strike of the shovel uncovered a secret buried for decades. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The sun, merciless and ancient, rose each morning over the dry plains of New Mexico, as if determined to test the endurance of every living thing beneath it. The land stretched endlessly, a vast sheet of cracked clay and dust that seemed to crumble under the slightest touch. Each fracture in the soil resembled an old wound, never healed, constantly reopening beneath the relentless heat. This land had seen drought before, but never like this. It was as though the earth itself had given up hope. In the middle of that harsh landscape stood the farm of Edward Miller, a place that once held promise and life but had long since succumbed to exhaustion. The farmhouse, built by Edward's grandfather in a time when the rain had been plentiful and the soil generous, now sagged at the corners and bore dark patches of water damage from storms that were nothing more than distant memories. The paint had long peeled away, leaving the wood exposed to sun and wind. But Edward did not care about appearances. Survival meant far more than beauty. Every morning before the first hints of daylight brushed the horizon, Edward rose from his bed. He rarely slept past 3 or 4 hours anyway, and even those hours were restless, filled with dreams that quickly turned into worries as soon as his eyes opened. His movements had a heaviness to them, not just from the years of physical labor, but from the weight of fear that lingered inside him like an unwelcome tenant. He dressed in silence, putting on the same worn-out jeans and faded shirt that smelled of sun, sweat, and soil. Then he pulled on his boots, cracked and stiff from age, and stepped outside into the cool darkness. For a few peaceful moments, the world seemed asleep. The sky shimmered with stars, and a gentle breeze carried a faint scent of dusty sagebrush. But Edward knew this tranquility would not last. As soon as the sun appeared, the cool air would vanish, replaced by a suffocating blanket of heat that only made the land appear more lifeless. He walked to the barn, where his few remaining animals stirred. He whispered a greeting to them, though they did not reply. The chickens pecked lazily at the straw, their feathers dull and ruffled. A single aging goat bleated weakly, its ribs visible through a thin coat. Edward ran a comforting hand along its back, though he knew affection alone could not replace the water and food it desperately needed. The farm had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had arrived when the government encouraged settlement across the West, granting land to those willing to work it. The stories told of lush fields, abundant harvests, and seasons where the barns overflowed with produce. Edward's father had inherited that pride, spending his life teaching his son to respect the land. There had been hardships back then too, but never like this. His father always said that the earth rewarded patience and loyalty, that the land never abandoned a man who refused to abandon it. But Edward now wondered if the land had finally changed its mind. His thoughts often drifted to his wife, Sarah. She had died several years earlier, taken by an illness that came swiftly and allowed no mercy. In the evenings, when the sunset painted the sky with melancholy colors, he would sit beneath the old cottonwood tree behind the house and imagine she was still beside him. She used to tell him that they were rich, even when money was scarce, because they had each other and the land under their feet. She believed happiness lived in the simple things: a well-grown crop, a home-cooked meal, the laughter of their children running through the fields. Now the laughter was gone. Their children, unable to find any future here, had moved to the city where steady jobs and full grocery stores replaced dreams of farming. They called him whenever they could and urged him to come live with them. But Edward could not bring himself to leave. Every inch of this land held memories of his father's footsteps, his wife's smile, his children's first steps. He could not walk away from that. Yet the memories were no protection against the reality that strangled him day by day. The bank, cold and unyielding, had sent the latest notice just the week before. If he could not pay his debt in 2 weeks, they would seize the property and sell it to a corporation already eager to expand its holdings in the area. Edward knew that the men behind those letters had probably never touched soil with their bare hands. They likely lived in tall buildings made of steel and glass, making decisions that destroyed lives without losing a moment of sleep. To them, his land was nothing more than a number on a page, a transaction waiting to be completed. He had borrowed money 2 years earlier when the first drought hit, believing that the skies would eventually change, that a good harvest would allow him to repay everything. But the rain never came. Each season grew hotter, the ground drier. Now he stood on the edge of disaster. He calculated his earnings every night, but the numbers mocked him. The chickens did not lay enough eggs to sell. The small patch of surviving corn would barely feed him and the animals. And even if he tried to sell the farm now, he would never earn enough to cover what he owed. Neighbors, once friendly and supportive, had begun offering quiet pieces of advice he did not ask for. They spoke of better opportunities elsewhere, of selling before the bank took everything. They asked whether he was afraid of ending up with nothing. Edward always responded with the same simple words, "This is my home." But inside, fear gnawed at him. It was a constant whisper. What if they were right? What if staying meant choosing ruin? As dawn painted the sky with a fiery glow, Edward walked into the field with his shovel resting against his shoulder. He looked across the barren rows where crops once thrived. The soil had become stubborn, resisting every attempt he made to revive it. Sweat formed on his brow long before the heat demanded it, for the effort was exhausting and seemed pointless. Still, he thrust the shovel into the ground, turning clumps of earth that refused to cooperate. With every strike, he felt his frustration intensify. The shovel hit something solid again and again, refusing to dig deeper. He stumbled back, gasping as the unforgiving landscape swallowed the little hope he had left. He forced himself to continue, determined not to show weakness, even if there was no one there to witness it. When his arms tired, he paused and gazed around him. The horizon shimmered under the intensifying sun. In the distance, a dust cloud rose as a truck drove down the main road. For a moment, the sight filled him with dread. Another visit from the bank, perhaps. But the truck passed without turning toward his farm. Relief came, but only briefly. He crouched down, scooping up a handful of dry soil, letting it slip through his fingers like sand in an hourglass. Time, like the land, was running out. He wondered what his father would say if he could see him now. Would he tell him to keep fighting? Or would he finally admit defeat was near? Edward clenched his teeth as though bracing against that thought. Giving up was not an option, not yet. By late afternoon, the sun hung directly overhead, forcing Edward to retreat into the shade beside the barn. His clothes clung to him, drenched in sweat. He wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve and stared at the fields, which seemed to mock him with their barrenness. The silence that stretched across the farm was heavy and unforgiving, as though the land itself had already accepted its fate and wondered why he had not done the same. He thought once more of his children. He imagined their concerned expressions each time they asked him to leave. They did not understand what it meant to have roots. In the city, life was about movement, change, and opportunity. But here, if you left, you lost something irreplaceable. The land was identity. It was history. It was a promise made by generations that he was not willing to break. As night crept closer, the heat gradually faded, replaced by an eerie calm. Edward finished his modest dinner alone at the kitchen table and stepped outside. The cottonwood tree stood tall, its branches creaking softly in the breeze. He sat near its trunk, the rough bark pressing into his back, and gazed up at the stars now scattered across the sky. He could almost hear Sarah's voice reminding him that hope had to be stronger than fear. But even her memory could not drown out the doubt that had become his constant companion. Eventually, he forced himself to his feet and returned inside. The house felt too large for one person, but too fragile to feel like protection. Lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling, traces of moonlight slipping in through the window, casting pale lines across the room. Every muscle in his body ached from labor, yet his mind refused to rest. Thoughts twisted into worries into images of foreclosure notices and eviction orders. He pictured strangers walking across his land, bulldozers tearing up the ground, the house being torn down as if it had never mattered. His breathing quickened as panic threatened to overwhelm him. He turned onto his side and shut his eyes tightly, desperate to find even a moment of reprieve. But sleep, when it finally came, brought no peace. His dreams were filled with fractured images of cracked soil and the echoing sound of shovels striking rock. Each strike a reminder of the relentless struggle he faced. When the first faint glimmer of morning appeared once more, Edward opened his eyes with a heavy sigh. He sat up slowly, feeling the fatigue deep in his bones. Part of him wondered how much longer he could continue, but another part, stubborn and resilient, pushed him onward. There was still work to be done. There was still time, however little. He stood, stretched his aching back, and prepared for yet another day. His fate felt like a noose tightening a little more with every sunrise, yet the land still called to him. As long as he drew breath, he would answer. What Edward did not know as he stepped outside into the dim pre-dawn light was that this day would not be like the others. Beneath the dry soil lay a secret waiting to be uncovered, something that had slept for decades in the darkness, holding a story of power, injustice, and redemption. That secret would soon rise back into the world, turned up by the persistence of a man who refused to surrender. And when it surfaced, the life that Edward Miller had known, filled with silence, fear, and the steady decline of hope, would change forever. The first glow of dawn brought with it a faint breeze, the kind that seemed to whisper promises it could not keep. Edward Miller stepped outside, feeling the coolness against his skin, knowing well it would not last. The morning was quiet, almost deceptively peaceful, as though nature wanted to offer him one last moment of comfort before the furnace of the day set in. He breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the dusty air, and looked out over the desolate stretch of land that surrounded his home. Every morning he prayed for a sign, a shift in the clouds, the scent of coming rain, a hint that the earth had not forsaken him. But today appeared no different than the many mornings before it. The sun began to push upward over the horizon, a blazing eye slowly opening, ready to glare down upon everything below. Edward braced himself for the heat to come. He wiped his face with a hand already coated in dry soil from the barn chores he had completed mere minutes earlier, then lifted the shovel from against the wall. Its handle was worn smooth, the blade nicked from countless battles with the stubborn ground. He had used the same shovel since he was a young man helping his father, and though it showed its age, he trusted it like an old companion. Together they would face another day. He walked toward the far side of the field, where the soil looked slightly less hopeless than the rest. It was a futile distinction, really. Everything looked dry and brittle, but he clung to even the faintest illusion of potential. Each step stirred tiny clouds of dust that clung to his boots and trailed behind him like ghosts of better years. He tried to ignore the ache in his legs and the heaviness in his chest. He told himself that labor was the only weapon he had left, the only act that could defy the reality looming ever closer. At the edge of the field, he paused to catch his breath and wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. Sweat, so early in the day. It was a reminder that his body continued to fight alongside him, despite exhaustion so deep it felt like it had wrapped around his bones. He dug the shovel into the hard earth, feeling it resist as it always did. The first few strikes only loosened the top layer of dust, as though the ground mocked his efforts by giving up nothing of value. His muscles strained as he forced the blade deeper, turning clumps of soil that fell apart like old parchment. He worked methodically, letting his body fall into the rhythm his mind tried to break. Each time the shovel struck down, his thoughts roared forward. 2 weeks until foreclosure, 2 weeks until strangers would walk the perimeter of his land and mark it as theirs. He imagined the bank representatives, those emotionless eyes hiding behind polished glass doors, planning what they would do with his fields once they belonged to them. He pictured heavy machinery tearing apart the earth, leveling everything his family had poured their lives into. The thought ignited a frustration so intense that he slammed the shovel into the ground harder than he meant to. The sound that followed stopped him cold. It wasn't the dull thud of metal hitting stone. This was something sharper, more resonant. He frowned and struck again, deliberately this time. The same metallic clang echoed upward, distinct and out of place beneath the dirt. His pulse quickened as he knelt, brushing away the topsoil with trembling fingers. The dirt fell away, revealing a hint of something unnaturally smooth beneath it. He dug with both hands now, soil gathering beneath his fingernails as the shape began to emerge. Angular, solid, and certainly not a rock. A box. For a moment, Edward simply stared, unable to accept what he was seeing. His heart hammered against his ribs, excitement and disbelief tangling in his chest. He grabbed the shovel again, clearing the earth around the edges of the object with more feverish urgency until he could grip it with both hands. It was heavier than anything that size ought to be, and he struggled to pull it free. When it finally came loose, he fell backward onto the dry soil, the metal box resting in front of him like some forgotten relic of the past. A chill seemed to cut through the heat, crawling across his skin as he surveyed the find. The box was coated with rust, yet still sturdy enough to have endured years beneath the earth. There were markings on the metal, though time and soil had obscured many of them. A lock hung from the front, a thick, old-fashioned padlock crusted with dirt. Someone had sealed this box with purpose. Someone had intended for it to remain hidden. Edward's breath caught in his throat. Questions flooded his mind. How long had it been there? Who had buried it? Why? And most importantly, what was inside? Instinctively, he lifted his gaze and scanned the horizon. No one was near. No neighbors. No vehicles. No distant silhouettes creeping across the field. The land stretched empty and silent, but he suddenly felt exposed, as though the sky itself had eyes. Fear prickled through him as he quickly wiped the box clean enough to hide it under his shirt, then bundled it into a sack he used to carry tools. He placed the shovel on top, concealing what lay beneath, and carried the load toward the house with cautious steps. Inside, the box was set down in the dimmest corner of the barn, while he finished the rest of his chores with distracted haste. Every moment he spent away from it felt like a risk. As soon as the sun began to sink and the heat subsided enough to breathe comfortably, he returned to retrieve it, cradling it against his chest as though someone might appear this very second to snatch it away. Even after entering the house and locking the door behind him, a persistent unease clung to him. He glanced out each window, searching for movement, convinced that the moment he discovered the box, the universe would conspire to take it from him. Only when he saw nothing but stillness did he finally sit before the kitchen table, placing the box atop it with careful reverence. The lamplight flickered against the metal, casting long, uncertain shadows. Edward's hands shook as he studied the padlock. It was old, the metal brittle from time. He fetched a hammer and a sturdy flathead tool from a drawer. Sweat trickled down his temples as he raised the hammer and struck. The first hit sent a harsh jolt up his arm, but the lock held. He tried again, harder. On the third attempt, the rusted mechanism snapped with a harsh crack, falling onto the table in two jagged pieces. Silence rushed into the room. Edward set the hammer aside, fingers curling beneath the lid of the box. He hesitated, pulse roaring through his ears. For one fleeting second, he feared that whatever lay inside might be worse than the not knowing that it might be something dangerous, something that would prove how foolish he was to open doors that the past had shut for a reason. But curiosity thrust aside all doubt. The hinges groaned as he lifted the lid, revealing a layer of dust so thick it appeared untouched by air for decades. Beneath the brittle layer rested stacks of paper and cloth-wrapped bundles. He reached for the topmost stack gingerly, shaking off the dust to reveal faded currency bills, printed in styles he recognized only from history books, bearing the portraits of long-dead leaders. The edges were fragile, the ink muted by age, but the value they once held, and perhaps still held, was undeniable. His breath caught, filling his chest with a surge of heat that felt like the faintest pulse of hope. But the money was not what pulled his focus most powerfully. It was the documents lying beneath it, thick folders bound with discolored twine. When he opened the first, he found maps, detailed, hand-drawn maps marking boundaries of land in the region. The shapes were recognizable: his farm, the neighboring fields, properties that now belonged to the same bank threatening to take everything from him. Some maps were stamped with official seals, others signed by names he had heard murmured in old stories about the area's founding families. He continued, uncovering land deeds, legal documents with dates so old they seemed unreal. His eyes widened as he read the descriptions. These papers suggested that the land now swallowed up by corporate ownership had once been in the possession of families like his. Entire expanses of countryside mapped out with names he didn't know but felt connected to, as though the ink carried the weight of stolen histories. Edward leaned back, feeling dizzy. His hands trembled above the open box. his mind spinning with disbelief and possibility. This discovery wasn't just a stroke of luck. It was a revelation. Something had happened here long before his father was born, something that had stripped rightful owners of what was theirs. And now, by some twist of fate, the evidence of that past wrongdoing was sitting on his table. He pressed a palm against his forehead, trying to steady himself as his thoughts collided. If these documents were valid, truly valid, they could prove everything he suspected about the corporation and the bank. They could expose their claims as illegitimate. They could save his land. They could save more than just his land. Yet with that hope came fear. Fear that possessing these papers would put him in danger. Fear that the moment he revealed what he found, powerful people would do anything to silence him. Fear that the box was not a gift from fate, but a burden too heavy for one man to carry. Night wrapped itself around the farmhouse as Edward stared down at the open box. The flame of the lamp fluttered, bending shadows across the walls like reaching hands. He slowly gathered the documents back into the container and closed the lid with care, though he refused to lock it again. That barrier had already been broken. There was no going back. He sat motionless for a long time, listening to his own breathing and the occasional creak of the house settling under the weight of memory. Every once in a while, he glanced toward the windows, terrified he might see headlights approaching or figures lurking in the dark. Nothing stirred. The world outside remained as still and quiet as any other night. Yet he no longer trusted that stillness. Eventually, exhaustion pried his eyes halfway closed, but even as he drifted into fitful sleep at the table, his hand never strayed far from the box. The last clear thought that passed through his mind before sleep claimed him was that his life had shifted, tilted on an axis he had not seen coming. The sun would rise again tomorrow, but it would rise on a different man, one who carried a secret buried deep beneath the soil and now resurrected in the flicker of lamplight. A secret that could destroy him, a secret that could save him, a secret that refused to remain buried any longer. Morning did not greet Edward with the gentleness of a new beginning. Instead, it came crawling into his consciousness like a heavy fog, thick with tension and unease. He awakened in the wooden chair where he had slumped over in the night, his cheek pressed against the cool, worn surface of the kitchen table. For a moment, confusion clouded his memory. Then his eyes fell upon the metal box sitting silently before him, and everything rushed back with startling clarity. The shock of the discovery, the anxious thrill, the voices of doubt and hope warring inside him, none of it had been a dream. The box was real. The documents inside were real, and now they belonged to him, for better or worse. His hand hovered above the lid, but he did not open it again. The sight of it alone was enough to stir the emotions that had stolen his sleep. He straightened his back slowly, feeling stiffness tug at every muscle. The sun had just begun to rise, soft rays filtering through the thin curtains and painting the room in pale gold. Under any other circumstance, this might have been a peaceful start to the day, but Edward felt as though his heart had taken on the weight of a boulder during the night. He forced himself to step away from the box, though doing so felt like tearing away from something alive. There were chores to do, routine that had become the structure of his days. If he stopped moving, even for a moment, he feared his mind would collapse under the pressure of fear and possibility. After splashing water on his face at the kitchen sink, he pulled on his boots and headed outside. The door creaked behind him like a warning, as if the house itself understood the magnitude of the secret hidden within its walls. The morning air was crisp, but Edward barely noticed. Every thought circled back to the documents like crows to a carcass. His eyes scanned the fields, though not with the same exhaustion he felt the day before. Now every clump of soil looked like it could be hiding something more. Another secret, another chapter of buried truth. He wondered how many others had walked this very land over the decades, carrying knowledge that had remained hidden from future hands. He wondered if those people had been forced to leave their homes by the same powers now threatening him. He fed the animals quietly, lost in thought. The chickens pecked at the grain with subdued enthusiasm, while the goat seemed oblivious to anything beyond its immediate hunger. Life on the farm continued, ignorant of the storm brewing beneath its surface. Edward envied that ignorance. The simplicity of survival was something he had understood well yesterday. Now he carried the burden of something far more complicated, something that could not be solved with sweat and soil alone. As he worked, he tried to study the documents again in his mind. The maps had shown not just his property, but large areas surrounding it. Acres upon acres that had once been marked with family names, names that no longer appeared anywhere in the county records. Where had those families gone? How had their lands slipped into the grasp of banks and corporations? It did not feel like coincidence. It felt like theft wrapped in legality, sanctioned through signatures and seals that erased men's lives without ever lifting a weapon. His chest tightened as he imagined strangers in suits smiling at the fortune they built on the ruins of families like his. The sun climbed higher, and the air grew hotter by the minute. With every passing hour, the pressure in Edward's mind intensified. The uneasiness stalked him like a predator, whispering that eyes were watching, that ears were listening. He found himself turning his head with sudden urgency whenever a branch snapped or a distant engine hummed. He knew well enough that paranoia could destroy a man just as quickly as any danger lurking outside, but acknowledging the thought didn't chase it away. Midday dragged on, and Edward returned to the house seeking shade and the illusion of safety behind locked doors. The box still sat on the table exactly where he left it. Its presence seemed to pulse with meaning, demanding his attention even as he tried to resist. He approached slowly, placing his hands flat on the surface and leaning over it as though he might absorb answers through touch alone. What if these documents were more than historical records? What if they were the kind of evidence that could unravel powerful interests and spark battles fought in courtrooms or in shadows? Edward imagined officials brushing aside his claims simply because he was a farmer without influence or allies. Worse still, he pictured ruthless men arriving in the dead of night, determined to silence him before he even spoke. The thought made his stomach twist. He backed away and paced across the kitchen floor, his boots tracing invisible paths of worry. He did not know whom he could trust with something so dangerous. Sharing this knowledge with the wrong person could cost him his life, and yet keeping it hidden might lead no further than where he already stood, on the brink of losing everything. His mind drifted back to the bank's visits. The men who had come to his property wore expressions devoid of compassion. They spoke in rehearsed lines about procedures, deadlines, and obligations. They never once looked into his eyes as though seeing a human being. Edward remembered the way they had inspected his land, taking notes like scavengers waiting for the final breath of their prey. He clenched his fists, heat blooming in his chest as anger replaced fear. At least for a moment. The day wore into evening, but he could not find rest. Even cooking himself a small dinner felt like manual labor, and every bite tasted like dust. He sat at the table again, staring at the documents. Eventually, he could not resist opening the lid once more. His fingers brushed over the old papers with reverence and apprehension. He unfolded a map slowly, smoothing out its creases. The ink lines drew the history of the region, each mark a testimony of intention and betrayal. He studied the official seals stamped in deep red ink, still vivid despite their age. They belonged to governmental offices and land authorities that had disappeared or transformed over time, making their trace almost impossible to follow without expertise. Whoever had created these maps and deeds had possessed knowledge, influence, and a clear purpose. His hand shook slightly as he picked up a deed describing his own farmland, written in elegant script, signed by an official whose name he recognized from stories of long-forgotten political battles. But beside the signature, there was another mark initials he did not know, but suspected carried significance. Beneath that were conditions of ownership, ones that contradicted everything the bank had ever claimed. The land could not legally be seized under terms of drought or economic hardship. It was protected for the family that cultivated it. Yet here he was, facing eviction. Edward's heart began to race. He understood now that he had stumbled upon evidence showing he was not only a victim of unfortunate circumstance, he was the target of a systematic erasure of rights that should have protected him. He felt anger rise again, this time more profound, more rooted in the injustice inflicted upon his family and neighbors. The bank's confidence suddenly made sense. They believed no one would ever find proof of their wrongdoing. With the weight of this revelation pressing deeper into his bones, Edward felt a shift inside him. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he did not feel entirely powerless. Beneath his fear and confusion, a spark ignited, a spark of purpose, of determination. He could not simply bury the truth again, even if it cost him dearly. He knew that now. But knowing the path forward was not the same as being ready to walk it. As the night grew darker, anxiety crept back with quiet footsteps. He imagined the walls closing in, the windows no longer offering protection, but vulnerability. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the siding made him jump in his chair. The secret no longer sat quietly in the box. It filled every shadow of his home with tension. By the time Edward rose to shut the curtains tightly, the moon had risen high in the sky, bathing the fields in silver light. From inside the house, he saw his land as he had never seen it before, not as a burden destined to be lost, but as something precious in need of defending. The crops may have withered, the soil may have hardened, yet beneath the dryness lay truth, heritage, and dignity. He lingered at the window, his gaze tracing the familiar lines of his field in the moonlight. He pictured his wife in the kitchen, laughing as she cooked, telling him that his hands were the hands of a man chosen by the land. He pictured his children running barefoot through the grassy rows that once thrived under his care, their carefree shouts echoing into the summer evenings. Those days had felt ordinary then, but now they glowed in his memory like jewels. Turning away, he returned to the table and let his fingertips glide over the cool metal surface of the box. His father would have known what to do. His father would have had contacts, allies, friends, but his father was gone. The responsibility rested solely on him. He realized with a slow clarity that he could not handle this alone. Somewhere out there, someone must understand the importance of these documents. Someone must know how to use them, how to expose the truth without letting it be buried again, but how to find that person, and how to trust them once he did. The question lingered unanswered as he sat there, hands clasped tightly, head bowed beneath the weight of uncertainty. Sleep eventually took him, though it was restless and sharp-edged like a blade. He dreamed of men in dark suits marching across his field with shovels in their hands, digging deep into the soil as though searching for the life he had tried so desperately to preserve. They found the box. They opened it. They smiled not with joy but with cruelty, and tossed each document into a roaring fire that sprang up from nothing, consuming everything instantly. Edward screamed, but no sound left his throat. He awoke with his heart pounding, sweat cooling rapidly on his skin. The night outside was silent, yet he could not shake the feeling of invisible danger drawing closer. The secret could not stay hidden forever. Its presence changed everything, and the world beyond his fences would soon feel its influence too, whether he was ready or not. As dawn's first light crept into the kitchen, Edward looked at the box with a new understanding. The truth it contained was a fire ready to burn through the lies built around his land, and others like it. But fire needed guidance, or it could consume everything in its path. He would need help. Someone who carried knowledge of the past and could navigate the perilous corridors of law and power. Someone who cared about justice more than profit. He could not yet imagine who such a person might be. But one thing was certain. This secret had chosen him, and now he had to decide whether he would rise to meet the responsibility it imposed. Outside, the land waited unchanged but no longer silent. And in that waiting, there was a restless hum, like the pulse of history waking from a long sleep. Edward inhaled, squared his shoulders, and faced the day ahead. He knew the moment was approaching when he would have no choice but to act. The box had brought him to a crossroads. Soon he would discover where the path forward truly led. The next morning arrived like a warning. Edward felt it the moment he opened his eyes, even though the room was still cloaked in early dawn shadows. It was not exhaustion this time, nor the dread that had stalked him each morning during the past few months. It was something new, a tension in the air, a sense of impending shift. His home no longer felt like the same quiet refuge it had been yesterday. The box resting beneath the floorboards carried a silent presence, as if it were breathing in the dark along with him. He rose slowly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and listened for any sound that might hint at trouble beyond his walls. Silence answered him. Part of him wanted to believe it would remain that way, that he would have the time he needed to figure out what came next. He slipped on his boots and stepped outside, the air already warm despite the early hour. The land spread out before him like a vast tapestry of memories and uncertainty. Edward went through the motions of mourning, as though his body remembered the rhythm better than his mind. The animals stirred lazily as he fed them, but their usual routine provided no comfort. His thoughts kept circling back to the documents hidden beneath the floor. Every creak in the barn, every flutter of wings overhead sharpened his awareness. He felt as though the world had begun turning faster, dragging him forward whether he was ready or not. He walked to the field afterward, shovel in hand, as though stubbornness alone could keep his life on the rails. He pierced the hard ground with the blade, the motion still familiar, even though the purpose behind it had shifted. It was no longer just a fight for survival. It had become a war against forces that had stolen from him and others, without a trace of guilt. His breath deepened as he worked, each heave of the shovel fueled by a growing determination he had not known he carried. Hours passed in this manner, his hands and arms moving while his mind wrestled with fear and resolve. When the sun finally climbed high enough to demand a break, Edward wiped the sweat from his forehead and returned to the house to refill his water jug. He reached the porch when he heard it, the steady tap of footsteps along the dusty road. His heart seized. He turned sharply, gripping the jug so tightly his knuckles turned white. A lone figure approached, not one of the bank's polished men, not a neighbor he recognized. This man walked with the pace of someone who had traveled far and carried stories worth telling. He wore a light shirt, an old-fashioned vest, a hat shading much of his expression, and leaned heavily on a wooden cane. Even from a distance, Edward noticed the age in his stooped shoulders, yet something about the way he held himself radiated authority. The stranger stopped before the gate, lifting his head to meet Edward's eyes. There was something in his gaze-sharp intelligence, a depth of experience that made Edward's pulse quicken. He set the jug down slowly, bracing himself without knowing whether he was preparing for danger or revelation. "Edward Miller," the man said, his voice carrying the grit of many miles and many years. Edward stiffened slightly. "Who's asking?" he said, though caution cracked through his tone like fragile glass. The man stepped forward and removed his hat as a gesture of respect. His hair was mostly silver, his face lined with time rather than weakness. "My name is Charles Holloway," he replied. "I believe you have something that once belonged to my father." The words struck Edward like a hammer to the chest. His mind flashed instantly to the box hidden beneath the floor. He felt anger flare first, anger that someone already knew, and that this knowledge was slipping further from his control. But beneath that anger lay fear. Had someone seen him? Had the soil whispered its secrets to someone else? "You've come to the wrong place," Edward murmured, trying to close himself from the confrontation. But the stranger's gaze stayed fixed on him with calm firmness. Charles Holloway took a few more steps and rested both hands on the cane's handle. "Your land," he began, "is a part of a story much older than you or me. My father was a man who believed in justice. He fought to protect the people who built their lives upon this soil. But corruption and power have a cruel way of swallowing righteousness. He had documents, maps, deeds, proofs of ownership, and when the tide of greed rose high enough to drown him, he hid them, hoping someday someone would bring them back into the light." Edward stood frozen. Every word triggered a fresh jolt of realization. This was no bank representative. This was not a buyer sent to pressure him. This man was part of the story buried in that box, more deeply connected than Edward had imagined. "How do you know anything about me?" he asked, his voice tight. "I've spent years searching," Charles answered. "My father left behind fragments of information, enough to point me here. But until now, I was never certain. When the drought forced so many farms into crisis, I thought perhaps the truth would finally surface. And when I heard of a man defying the bank's pressure with a stubbornness that seemed almost personal, I knew it had to be you." Edward felt a wry, bitter twinge at the word stubbornness, though he had no strength to protest. His thoughts churned. If this man truly knew the contents of the box, then his fears of discovery had not been paranoia, they had been warnings. He considered denying everything again, But something about Charles Holloway's presence made lies feel pointless. The man's eyes held too much knowledge, too much loss. Finally, Edward gestured toward the house. "Come inside," he said. They stepped into the kitchen, the air tense and heavy. Edward knelt near the floor, pried open the hidden boards and retrieved the box. As he placed it on the table, he watched Charles closely, searching for any sign of deceit. Instead, he saw the older man's lips part ever so slightly with a breath of awe and grief. Charles reached out, fingertips trembling as he traced the metal. "I thought it was lost forever," he whispered. And for the first time, Edward saw vulnerability break through his composed exterior. Edward opened the lid, revealing the aged maps and documents within. Charles leaned in, his eyes scanning the contents with a reverence that made Edward feel he was witnessing something sacred. As the old man gently lifted a land deed, tears welled at the corners of his eyes. It was an expression of a lifetime of searching, a mission finally justified. He looked up, meeting Edward's uncertain gaze. "These papers represent the truth that was stolen," he said. "People were stripped of everything, their land, their dignity, their lives' work. My father tried to stop it, and he paid dearly." Edward swallowed hard. "And now the bank wants to take this land too," he muttered. "They're confident, too confident. They act like they have already won." "They've gotten away with this sort of thing for far too long," Charles replied, his voice strengthening. "But these documents can prove the illegitimate nature of their claims, not only for you, for countless families." The implication struck Edward with staggering force. He had been so focused on his personal fight that he had not fully grasped the wider scope. His battle was not solitary. Others suffered the same injustice. Entire histories erased so corporations could prosper from the land's silent surrender. "We'll need experts," Charles continued. "Historians to verify the origins, lawyers to navigate the inevitable backlash. There are people in the state capitol who have spent their lives studying land rights. They will understand the value of what you found." Edward stared at the box again. The documents no longer looked like a lifeline intended solely for him. They appeared like a flag of revolt raised against decades of exploitation. The heaviness inside him shifted, transforming from fear into purpose. "What if the bank finds out?" he asked quietly. "They will," Charles said with stark honesty. "Powerful people never let go of what they've stolen without a fight. But if we stay silent, they will continue to take, and the land will keep losing its rightful caretakers." Edward looked out the window, his gaze settling on the distant fields that once thrived under his family's hands. He imagined them growing again. He imagined laughter, not desperation, filling the air. Then he thought of his neighbors' men and women who had walked away, not because they wanted to, but because they had been pushed to the edge. He turned back to Charles and nodded, the decision solidifying like roots anchoring deep into the earth. "Let's take this to the Capitol," he said. A spark of gratitude lit in the older man's eyes. He placed one hand atop the box and the other over Edward's. "Your courage will give others strength," he said. They spent the rest of the day preparing for the journey. Edward packed a small bag, just enough clothing and necessities for the road. Charles, though weary from travel already endured, insisted he was ready to continue. Edward secured the box tightly beneath layers of fabric inside a sack normally used for grain. He would not let this evidence fall into the wrong hands. As night approached, they sat briefly outside the farmhouse, the horizon painted in deep purples and gold. Crickets chirped, and the air felt cooler than it had in weeks. Edward allowed himself to breathe a little more deeply than before. The unknown future loomed ahead, dark and unpredictable, but it carried something his life had lacked for far too long: hope. He looked around his land, his home, and felt an unspoken promise linger in the wind. He would return. He would reclaim what was his, and those who had endured the same quiet suffering would finally see justice push through the cracks, like new green shoots forcing their way up from parched earth. When they retired to rest, Edward lay awake long after Charles's breathing had steadied in the spare room. He stared at the ceiling, his chest tight with mingled anticipation and fear. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a battle he never asked for, but one he was now determined to fight. The land had whispered its secret to him, resurrecting the story meant to be told. He closed his eyes and thought of his wife. He wondered if she would be proud of him for refusing to let darkness take root where hope once grew. He whispered a silent promise into the night. He would not let their legacy be stolen. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it carried him into dreams of rain falling over thriving crops and of a sun that warmed rather than burned. The land was waiting for its redemption, and Edward Miller, with a stranger by his side and truth in his possession, was finally ready to answer its call. The morning that Edward Miller left his farm felt unlike any other morning in his life. The familiar world around him, the creaking boards of the porch beneath his boots, the faint smell of dry grass carried on the early breeze, the hush of the field stretching into the distance, seemed to exist on the edge of a great transformation. As he pulled the front door closed and slid the lock into place, he had the sudden sensation that he was stepping away not only from his home, but from the man he had been until now. The land remained behind him, silent and watchful, as though waiting to see whether its caretaker would prove worthy of the secret he carried. Charles Holloway stood by the truck they would take to the Capitol, leaning slightly on his cane, his tired eyes steady and alert. He nodded to Edward with a look of understanding that carried both reassurance and urgency. The sack containing the metal box was carefully nested beneath blankets, and a small supply of food, secured as if it were gold. In truth, its contents held far more value than gold could ever claim. The ride began under the rising sun, painting the sky with streaks of ochre and rose. Edward kept his gaze fixed on the passing scenery, the rough desert shrubs, the scatter of abandoned buildings that had succumbed to economic ruin, and the occasional wandering cattle whose ribs protruded through their hide. Life here moved slowly, and yet the consequences of that silence and neglect were everywhere. It became ever clearer that the story buried in the box was not about him alone. It was written into the bones of this land and the families who had once flourished upon it. The highway eventually widened, streets growing busier with every mile closer to the city. Edward felt the weight of eyes everywhere, people in passing cars, strangers walking the sidewalks, office windows towering above. Here anonymity was possible, and yet he felt strangely exposed. All it would take was one person recognizing the significance of the box, and everything could spiral. Charles led him first to a building with tall pillars and an American flag fluttering in the wind. Inside, they met a historian, whose curiosity ignited the moment Charles explained their purpose. The man wore thick glasses and had the distracted air of someone who lived more in books than in the present moment, but his attention snapped into sharp focus when the documents were laid out before him. He examined seals, compared handwriting styles, measured paper quality against a stack of reference samples. At times he muttered under his breath, occasionally glancing at Edward, as though reassessing the quiet man who had brought him such a find. Edward watched anxiously, hands resting on his knees, feeling like a stranger in a world made of polished wood and institutional order. Charles stood beside him, his posture alert, his cane clutched tightly as though grounding him to the moment. "These are original," the historian finally said, his voice low but loaded with significance. "Late 20th century, these land titles were legitimate, and if my eyes are not deceiving me, they were transferred without proper authorization." A tremor of disbelief and validation swept through Edward. His heart thudded heavily as the truth which he had only suspected until now rose from beneath the dust of decades. Before he could fully absorb the historian's words, Charles motioned toward another office. More experts gathered, lawyers specializing in land disputes, archivists who recognized the names stamped onto the deeds, a government representative whose expression shifted dramatically as she read through the papers. Each pair of eyes that studied the evidence widened with the same dawning realization. If these documents came to light publicly, they could change the fate of hundreds of acres and restore justice long denied. The conversations evolved quickly into formal meetings. Edward struggled to keep up with the legal language. Terms such as rightful title holder, historical precedence, injunction, and injunction relief swirling around him in dizzying currents. Yet he listened, absorbing as much as he could, feeling his determination harden like steel. This was no longer the desperate gamble of a man trying to save his own piece of land. This was a fight for truth, stolen from generations who labored in good faith. Reporters soon caught wind of the story. At first, just one journalist approached them in the lobby, a young woman with a notebook and a hunger for answers. But by late afternoon, that number had doubled and then tripled. Microphones were thrust toward Edward. Cameras flashed, voices clamored for quotes. He wanted nothing more than to slip away unnoticed. But he remembered Charles's words. His courage could give others strength. So he stood firm, speaking with humility and conviction. He explained how he found the box by accident, how he had feared losing the land that held his family's legacy, and how every farmer deserved to be treated with dignity rather than expendable collateral. Across the state, the story spread like wildfire. Headlines called him the farmer who dug up the truth and the man fighting for stolen land. Families who had left their homes years ago reached out with cautious hope, wondering whether their losses might be reversible. And in the high offices of the corporate executives who had bullied men like him, the news struck like a crack of thunder. That night, Edward sat in a guest house, provided by one of the officials assisting them. He stared out the window at the city lights sparkling against the night sky, a stark contrast to the starlit quiet of his farm. The box rested on the dresser beside him, not locked away, but close enough that he could guard it with his own presence. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more scrutiny, more confrontation with the giant that had stripped generations of their birthright. He knew the fight ahead would not be gentle. Days passed in a blur of legal petitions, media interviews, and mounting tension. The government confirmed the document's authenticity, issuing orders to pause any land seizures in Edward's region while investigations took place. The bank that had sent warnings to Edward suddenly retreated behind layers of silence. A spokesperson claimed they were cooperating fully with the review, though he offered no apology, no acknowledgement of the hardship they had inflicted. Edward had expected to feel triumph, satisfaction, perhaps even vengeance. Instead, he felt sobered by the enormity of what lay ahead. Justice was not a simple reversal. It required countless steps, each one measured and challenged and verified. But he also felt quiet pride, in the knowledge that he had not let fear bury the truth once again. One afternoon, government officials called a public meeting outside the courthouse. Edward arrived with Charles at his side. Dozens of people gathered, farmers, townsfolk, and displaced families who came to see the man who dared to rise against a hidden empire. The air buzzed with anticipation. When Edward stepped to the microphone, a hush fell like evening over the land. He spoke slowly, his voice rough with emotion. He talked about the dust on his boots, the blisters on his hands, and the hunger of working a land that gave back less each year. But he also spoke of love, the love his father had for the soil, the love his wife had for their simple life, the love he still carried for a future most believed had been stolen. "We are not just owners of land," he said. "We are keepers of history. Our presence here is proof that those who came before us mattered, and I won't let anyone erase that." His words rippled through the crowd, a quiet, trembling power. Heads nodded. Eyes glistened. Edward had never considered himself a speaker, yet in that moment, his voice echoed like thunder rolling across empty plains. Behind him, the state official stepped forward and made a historic announcement. The government would formally pursue restitution for all land found to have been taken illegally. Investigations would continue. The stories of those forgotten families would now be heard. Applause rose, soft at first, then swelling into something fuller, a wave of gratitude and renewed faith. A woman approached Edward afterward, clutching his hands in hers. She said her grandparents had lost their ranch during the same era, sent away with nothing but shame. Now, because of him, their name might be restored to the land they cherished. Another family thanked him for proving that integrity still had champions. Edward's eyes burned. He never thought he would be a source of hope to anyone. He had always seen himself as just a farmer, bound to the land by toil and duty. But now he understood that roots ran deeper than soil. They connected past to future, sorrow to resilience. That evening, as he and Charles prepared for the journey home, the older man looked upon him with quiet admiration. "Your fight has only just begun," he said, "but you have done what many could not. You gave voice to the buried truth." Edward nodded, gripping the sack that held the documents. The road ahead would be long and perhaps dangerous. The powerful did not surrender easily, yet he felt a clarity that carried him through his anxiety. He was no longer a man standing alone at the edge of ruin. He was a defender of justice, a guardian of history, and a reminder that one person's courage can ignite a fire bright enough to illuminate the darkest corners of corruption. As the truck rolled away from the city and the fields widened before them, Edward allowed himself to imagine his return home, not as a man defeated, but as a man vindicated. His land would feel different beneath his boots now. It would no longer whisper despair, but promise. And though the earth was cracked and tired, hope like rain would soon find its way back. He watched the horizon draw closer, carrying the silhouette of his farm, and in the glow of the setting sun, he felt certain that the truth he had unearthed would not only save the land beneath his feet, but restore the dignity of those who had loved it before him. Justice was finally on the move. The road home took them through long stretches of countryside where fields lay barren and neglected, like sleeping giants starved of life. Yet for the first time in years, Edward looked upon the landscape not with sorrow, but with newfound purpose. The same horizon that once seemed distant and unforgiving now appeared full of possibility, as though the land itself sensed that justice was stirring timidly, at first but steadily gaining strength. Charles Holloway rode beside him, occasionally pointing out old ranch names that once belonged to families connected to the hidden truth. The names resonated differently now, no longer markers of forgotten history, but testimonies waiting to be restored. By the time Edward pulled onto the dirt road leading to his farm, the sun hovered low in the sky, painting the ground with a warm golden glow that softened every rough edge. The farmhouse emerged from the distance like a weary friend, welcoming him back. Edward stepped out of the truck and stood for a moment, just absorbing the view. The wind rustled the dry grasses, carrying the subtle sense of dust and sage. His land, though still parched and fragile, looked somehow lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from its shoulders. The same might be said for Edward himself. He helped Charles settle into the house for the night. His companion's journey had been long and heavy with memories, some painful, others hopeful, and his tired limbs struggled against the weight of age. Edward insisted he rest while he carried the sack containing the metal box into his bedroom. He placed it carefully in a drawer, not because he feared theft anymore, but because he understood that the box's power lay not in being watched like treasure, but in being used like a tool. For now it could rest. The seed of change it carried had already been planted in minds far beyond this house. The nights that followed were filled with a peace Edward had not felt in years. He awoke each morning with renewed energy, stepping out into the morning air, feeling that, even if drought still ruled the skies, something had shifted. The bank's threats had lost their bite, and word from the capital continued arriving with encouraging news. More investigations underway, more families identified who might reclaim rights long denied. The corporate powers that once loomed like great shadows over the region now looked unsure, shaken. Edward felt their grasp loosening, finger by finger. The neighbors who once pitied him or avoided the subject of his looming foreclosure began visiting his farm again. Some came to congratulate him cautiously, uncertain how to express admiration to a man they once assumed lost. Others came with stories of their own families, tales of injustice that had never been resolved because no proof could be found until Edward dug it out of the ground. Many simply shook his hand silently, their grip strong with gratitude that did not need words. Edward accepted each gesture with humility. He did not see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man who had done what the moment required. Still, their presence stirred something warm in his chest. He was no longer alone in his struggle. He was surrounded by a community that had awakened from numb resignation into cautious optimism. He welcomed it gladly, though he could not help but wonder whether the fight ahead would challenge them in ways none of them could foresee. One afternoon, Edward walked into the center of his field. He let his boots sink into the dusty earth as he gazed across the furrows that awaited rebirth. He tried to imagine rows of thriving crops waving in the wind, animals grazing on lush grass, his grandchildren running freely through fields alive with green. The image felt distant, yet more attainable now than at any point in recent memory. He knelt and scooped a handful of soil into his palm, letting the grains roll through his fingers. The land seemed to pulse with faint anticipation, like a heart rediscovering its rhythm. The days continued like this, a balance of quiet labor and restless preparation. Charles remained at the farmhouse, battling illness that had worsened with travel. Yet he was resolute. Every morning he sorted through archived letters, documents, and old recordings, working with representatives from the capital who often visited to gather information. His voice had become the thread connecting generations, ensuring his father's intent reached the future intact. Edward watched him with admiration and concern, helping whenever possible while urging him to rest. As summer grew late, clouds began to gather more frequently overhead. Edward noticed it at first only in passing. A slight thickening of the sky, a faint smell of moisture that drifted across the farm after dusk. It was so subtle that he did not dare mention it aloud for fear the sky would retract its promise. But the shift continued. Days grew less harsh. Nights cooled. The air softened. Then one morning Edward awoke to darkness. Not the darkness of night, but the darkness of dense storm clouds stretching across the sky. He rose and stepped outside, stunned at the sight. A deep rumble of thunder rolled across the horizon, shaking the air like a proclamation. He stood still, listening, feeling, waiting. The first raindrop struck his cheek with startling delicacy. He drew a sharp breath. Another drop followed, and another. Then the sky seemed to sigh, and the rain fell. At first a gentle drizzle, then a steady curtain of water that washed the dust from the air and soaked into the thirsty ground. Edward closed his eyes and lifted his face toward the storm. Cool water streamed along the lines of his skin, dripping from his chin, dampening his clothes until they clung to his body. He stood motionless, arms at his sides, allowing the rain to baptize him and cleanse the worry that had anchored itself in his bones for so long. Charles stepped onto the porch, gripping the railing for support. A faint smile etched across his face. Edward turned and met his gaze. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In that moment, everything was understood. The fight had brought rain, not as magic, but as testament. Change was real now, tangible and falling from the heavens. Edward walked forward into the field, boots sinking slightly as the soil softened beneath him. Each raindrop promised nourishment, revival, a future rewritten. He spread his arms and allowed himself to laugh, the sound rough at first, but quickly transforming into something free and triumphant. The memories of hardship still lived inside him, but they no longer ruled him. He remembered every night he had sat alone beneath the stars, drowning in fear. Every letter from the bank that had turned his stomach. Every moment he believed he had failed his family and his ancestors. But now those memories formed the foundation of his resilience. They defined not defeat, but strength. Later, when the storm eased to a steady patter, Edward returned to the porch where Charles waited. They sat side by side in silence, watching the rain revive what drought had strangled. After a long while, Charles placed a hand on Edward's shoulder. There was pride in his expression, not loud, but deep and unwavering. Edward covered the man's hand with his own, acknowledging the bond forged through shared struggle and belief. Evening arrived with a gentle glow, clouds parting just enough for the sky to show hints of color. The fields glistened like dark mirrors, drinking every drop the clouds had offered. Edward tightened his grip on the railing, feeling steadier than he ever had before. Tomorrow and every day after would bring challenges, but for the first time in a long time, he saw a path ahead that led somewhere worth going. He retired for the night, though he lingered by the window, unable to look away from the rain-soaked land outside. The earth seemed to breathe, slow and full like a creature awakening after a long hibernation. He pressed his palm against the cool glass and closed his eyes. In the quiet pulse of the storm, he felt the presence of his wife, his father, and his grandfather, whispering their approval, their pride, their love. He whispered back, a promise carried on the wind. The land will stay ours. Sleep finally came, soft and safe. The storm continued, tapping against the roof in a slow, steady rhythm like a heartbeat. In the days that followed, the transformation became visible. Shoots of green pierced the once lifeless ground. Neighbors rebuilt fences and reopened barns that had sat abandoned. Children laughed again, running barefoot through puddles. Word from the capital continued to bring updates of progress, restitution, and acknowledgement. Edward stood at the center of his farm, watching everything change as though he were waking from a nightmare into a long overdue dawn. He did not think of himself as a hero, yet the world around him carried traces of the courage he had unearthed along with that buried box. It had taken one man's refusal to surrender to save not just a farm, but an entire community's right to exist. The truth, once suffocated under layers of greed and dust, now breathed freely above ground. And as the sun broke through the clouds once more, illuminating the newly revived land, Edward smiled not with the relief of a battle survived, but with the quiet joy of a future reclaimed. Rain had fallen on restored earth, and hope deeply rooted and long buried was growing again. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what happens next. More life-changing stories are waiting for you on our channel. Watch another one right now. And share this video with someone who needs to see it. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments.